Welcome back to Lippincott Talk. This is another episode in the series I'm doing on American foreign policy. I'm explaining and explicating my dissertation research in this series. And today's episode is on the progressive break from the founders' foreign policy and the principles that helped guide that break. So in the last episode, I answered the question of was America an empire? Was America meant to be an empire from the founding? And I answer no. I show there that the founders' principles were devoted to the protection of natural rights and the preservation of the consent of the governed. And the foreign policy that came out of that view of justice was fundamentally non-interventionist and defensive. And I hold and argue that that foreign policy, that devotion to the protection of person and property, to the preservation of life, liberty, and happiness, was the cornerstone of American greatness, the foundation of what made us powerful as a nation. And I also then link that argument to our foreign policy now. What I want to show is the superiority of the founders' principles. I believe they were right. In the modern, contemporary, moralistic, crusading impulse that you see in American foreign policy now is antithetical to our tradition and actually bad for us. So in explaining, how did we get from the founders who essentially did not go abroad did not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, had peace and friendship with all nations. How do you go from that foreign policy, which extended throughout the 18th and 19th century? The United States fought wars, but it fought them primarily defensively, or it fought in its near abroad for expansion. Then you have the Civil War as well. But there was no idea of going abroad to monkey around in the Middle East or Europe. So how did you go from the founders' foreign policy to what we see in our own world now, where we're in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Bosnia, Somalia, Vietnam, Korea, then wars in Europe, wars into the Pacific. It's obviously a radical and dramatic change. And I argue that there's a change in the view of justice that occurs in American life. That for the founders, if foreign policy is fundamentally defensive, designed for the preservation of person and property, it preserves trade and peace with others, then the progressive foreign policy, which I trace really to the end of the 19th century and with the Spanish-American War as the turning point, that represents a turn to the messianic, missionary, crusading foreign policy. There's an interventionist quality that runs all throughout the progressive way of thinking. And that break emerges from the willingness of the progressives to reject the natural rights tradition which animated the founders. That if for the founders you have a focus on nature and nature's God, that's the standard for understanding where our rights come from. For the progressives, the standard is history. That if for the founders, there's an unchanging, human beings are a certain kind of way, and that means they have certain rights that inhere. There's a natural law. There's a framing that allows for it's unchanging, right? It doesn't blow in the wind, right? There's a cornerstone and foundation to the founders' thoughts that is not there in the progressive way of thinking. That for the progressives, the changing circumstances, the progress of technology, of morality and science have opened up new vistas for the human mind to understand, and in so doing have radically changed our understanding of the role of government, not just and the role of the nation state. So for the founders are nationalists in the sense that they believe there's an American nation. It has a social contract that creates that nation, and it has a view of justice rooted in consent and protection. So the founders have this very firm, natural rights rooted understanding of what government is for. They don't believe unlimited progress is inevitable. Decline is always a possibility. Tyranny is always a possibility. They believe that new knowledge about human affairs will not fundamentally alter the moral calculus at the heart of political life. But for the progressives, it's a very different view. And you see this in, John Burgess, Charles Merriam, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, these early figures who were both political and theoretical in terms of the development of progressive doctrine really show a fundamental break from that older American tradition. So this is, I think, crucially important. How can you understand the 20th century? How can you understand now our own contemporary affairs if you don't understand how we got to where we are? And I can't emphasize this enough. There was a break in the American tradition. That there is this moment where you can see it's not like it was before. And the Civil War is the catalyst, I think, for this turn. That the horrific destruction the nation went through, the fracturing and then the rejoining had a really profound psychological and spiritual effect on the individuals who lived through that war. And there was a turn away from, you kind of had the struggle of the war, the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis that flows out of the war. You have this conflict, and then it's resolved, and there's a new nation is born out of the conflict. That way of thinking very much lends itself to a progressive historicist understanding of the world. That there is, progress, you overcome the past, and there's this new rebirth that you on a new vista, a new plane. Science, technology, economics, it expands outwards, and civilized man then sees himself on top of the world. And he looks out, and he's from a new height, above where he was before. He's above his ancestors. He's above the uncivilized barbarians. He's above himself, right? Who he was. There's development and growth. So that's the powerful, I think, spiritual and psychological impulse that gives rise to progressivism in American life. At least this is a partial account, and I'm open to hearing. There's a lot to be said about this, and I'm happy to explain further and work through this further in the future if some of you feel that's necessary and useful. But again, I want to stress there is this change in American life, and I think it's very difficult to understand where we are now without understanding how important this change was to the abandonment of our older tradition and the establishment of the new, the kind of new world order that we know now. A key element of progressive thought is the turn to expertise. So there's a turn away from consent, from Republican government from the social compact. There's a turn to technocracy, expertise, credentials, degrees. The idea that you need an apolitical bureaucracy, nonpartisan commission, the idea of management, replacing politics. All of that's thematic in the progressive view of justice. And of course, it becomes crucially important to progressive foreign policy as well. I have here, and I think what I'll do is I'll read from some of the quotes from the progressives and kind of give you a sense of how their minds worked, what they thought about policy. And it's interesting. I find this period of American life to be really misunderstood. Full disclosure, I'm opposed to the progressives. I think they changed our regime in ways that were ultimately, I think, unhealthy and unhelpful. I think there's a straight line from the progressive project of the early 19th century, the late 19th century and early 20th century to our contemporary crisis. That there is a fundamental unity in the birth of the left out of the progressive era. That figures like Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, if they were here now, would adopt all of the same positions of the mainstream consensus on LGBTQ, open borders, foreign intervention. There's this unity that runs throughout both of those movements. And there are certainly changes, right? By the 1960s, you see changes in the American left that weren't there before in the same way. But I do think the strands, the fundamental concerns are there. The administrative state built by the progressives not only affected domestic policy, but foreign policy. I think there is a fundamental unity between what America does abroad and how we act at home. And the interventionist foreign policy that you see really beginning in earnest with the Spanish-American War, and I would say the open door note in regards to China, and we'll get into that. That's where you really see this transformation of American life. That all of the things that have come to character, that our foreign policy in terms of its interventionist quality, its messianic, moralizing quality, the idea that human beings need to be transformed in their soul, and the government can do so. That this is a project for experts and psychologists, and we just need to, if we can just manipulate procedural outcomes, we can have a new dawn, a rebirth, right? And the progressives present themselves fundamentally as non-revolutionary, right? They represent science, they represent morality, they represent progress, economic growth. Management, this new science, and welded to the science of psychology, is going to fix the human person, elevate his soul, bring about social justice. These animating spiritual drives for the perfection of the world characterize the progressive era. And they manifest themselves, I think, in an ultimately very radical politics and a radical break from what came before. For the founders, government is focused, narrow, it's limited, because there's the danger of tyranny. And that cannot simply be gotten around by expertise or credentials. In fact, quite the opposite. For the founders, there is no escaping from political life. There is no such thing as an apolitical bureaucrat. There's always a view of justice that's there in the open, that is political, and that you cannot avoid. The founders were very serious, but their regime was limited. It didn't mean it was powerless, but it meant it had a very narrow focus, laser focus on protection of rights. So the United States, for instance, in the founding period, had across the board very low tax rates, minimal regulation. It had a high standard for what citizenship meant. And it was simply the case, there was no welfare state. There was private property, there were, Tocqueville talks about this, these private associations, very prominent in American life. But there was not the coercive arm of the state in anywhere in the kind of degrees that you see it in the progressive era onward. There really is this transformation. And you can see maybe in the time of the founding, there were some places where the role of government is left ambiguous or there are questions, and that's certainly there and worth talking about. But the overarching view was very different. Founders really do consistently manifest the view of justice as protection and consent. And the progressives manifested as uplift on a global scale. So they're globalist, they're concerned with the world, they're concerned with intervention, with establishing righteousness. The overarching progressive impulse is one of confidence, optimism, and complete belief in oneself and in civilization, to the point of needing to impose it at gunpoint, right? So beginning in the progressive era, you see the turn away from non-intervention on the basis of morality. The progressives are not only there to, cure men's bodies and perfect them, but to save their souls. So there's this combination between science and reason that are brought together, science and faith, that are brought together in the progressive era in a I think, new way in American life, in a very important way politically. Here are some quotes from the progressives, just in terms of how they thought about how they thought about political life. Here, let me pull up Burgess. See these guys right here. And John W. Burgess was the father of American political science. He was a famous progressive. He created the first graduate school in American political science, and he, you can just see, like, for instance, he wrote that in 1893 that the state is the highest good and highest entity in political life. So for Burgess, the history of the world is to be taken as the revelation of providence in regard to human development. And, quote, we are forced to conclude that national states are intended by it as the prime organs of human development, and therefore it is the highest duty of the state to preserve, strengthen, and develop its own national character, unquote. So for Burgess, and this is in the 1890s, he's already foreseen the state, the concern is not the protection of the individual right to life, liberty, and happiness, but rather the state to mold and shape human development. Again, two very different concerns here. And And Burgess also manifests, a theme of what we would think of as racial superiority now, or white supremacy now. And I'll read some of the quotes from Burgess, but it's worth pointing out that the progressives had a very strident view of race and the supremacy of European man, or the white race, or the Teutonic race, as they would say. But this is also welded to the idea of the white man's burden, of extending civilization to others and uplifting the lower races to the level of Western civilization. So, for instance, Burgess says that Teutonic nations are particularly endowed with the capacity for establishing national states and are especially called to that work, and therefore that they are entrusted in the general economy of history with the mission of conducting the political civilization of the modern world, unquote. So for Burgess, it's European man is superior, and that comes with a duty to the rest of the world to uplift them. And that policy would become very clear in America's conquest of the Philippines and after the Spanish-American War. So, for Burgess, European man has this mission to spread civilization and to expel the barbarians, right, and punish the lower races if necessary in order to extend the project of civilization around the world. So Burgess says, quote, "The civilized state should, of course, exercise patience and forbearance toward the barbaric populations and exhaust every means of influence and of force to reduce them to subjection to its jurisdiction before adopting this policy of expulsion. But it should not be troubled in its conscience about the morality of this policy when it becomes manifestly necessary. It violates thereby no rights of these populations which are not petty and trifling in comparison with its transcendent right and duty to establish political and legal order everywhere," unquote. So for Burgess, the father of American political science, the founding father of, one of the founding fathers of progressivism in America, the claim here is if the founders had the concern with natural rights of individuals, Burgess sweeps that away in the name of uplifting civilization. In the name of spreading civilized values around the world, you can disregard the rights of the individual, you can disregard the barbarians and their way of life, and impose civilization by gunpoint if necessary. This is a very different view from that of the founders. And I think it's remarkable, and I think there's a connection here, and I'll get into this later, but there's a connection between this progressive quote-unquote racism and their later anti-racism. That the progressives begin with the idea of Western man is superior, he needs to spread his civilization, but this changes that concern with spreading civilization, with uplift, with superiority, ultimately becomes a kind of anti-racism, right? There's colonization that's been done badly, that there are Europeans who haven't done what they're supposed to in order to uplift the world, and that should be punished and rejected. But the concern is always there. There's this fundamental concern with the rest of the world, and I think that concern then becomes the foundation of the later anti-racist policies that we see in the post-war order. So the cycles of empire. At first it begins with, we're ruling over you because we're awesome. Then it becomes, we're ruling over you because we're here to help you. And then it becomes, actually, we're sorry that we ruled over you. And then it becomes, you should rule over us. And the progressives represent a mixture of, we're ruling over you because we're awesome, but the primary driving force is, we're ruling over you for your own good. And so in Burgess, you can see the approach to the lesser races, to the rest of the world, to the barbarians, is a view that we're ruling over these people in the name of science and progress in human development. That messianic mission is there and fundamental to this theoretical progressive project. And you have the state as the manifestation of human development. There's no concern with individual liberty, natural rights, rights that are everywhere and always among all human beings. Instead, you see the turn to history, development, spreading civilization, science, morality, religion bound up in this new historical vista. That's the historicist nature of the project. It's that there's There are truths that are only known in some times, in some places, or for some human beings, and they're not everywhere and always. There's that man's expansion and growth changes the way that he interacts with the world. And so Burgess is, the messianic quality of his work is striking. He says at one point that he denounces the weak sentimentality of those civilized whites who shy away from their righteous duty to uplift the non-Teutonic races. And his argument, of course, is that European man, Teutonic man, should rule because he has history and ethnology on his side. He can see the history of the world. He has science in the form of ethnology, and this entitles him to rule. It provides the elevated ground by which he can make the distinction between those who are civilized and uncivilized. And I think, one of the aspects of progressive thought then is this view that there are barbarians that need to be civilized, the non-Teutonic races. The counterpart to this, of course, is that same view gets imported into American politics, that there are barbarians among the American people who need to be uplifted. It's actually quite a short jump for the progressives to go from, well, there are these savages in grass huts on the other side of the world that need us to, uplift them, to, and there are people in America who are bitter clingers, to use that anachronism, who need to be perfected by progressive science. Charles Edward Merriam, who was a student of Burgess, made similar arguments to his teacher. He has a book, A History of American Political Theories, published in 1903. And Merriam argues that, the natural rights theories of the founders no longer have sway among America's political scientists. He says, quote, "In speaking of natural rights, it is essential to remember that these alleged rights have no political force whatever unless recognized and enforced by a state," unquote. And he goes on to say, quote, "Present tendency in American political theory is to disregard the once dominant ideas of natural rights and the social contract," unquote. And he says that the view of the social contract and natural rights is more powerful among the people than among political scientists. And that's, I think, it's an interesting view there. The experts, the Dr. Fauci's of that day, rejected the founders' views and saw them as anachronistic, barbaric, uncivilized. They needed to belong as part of man's development, but they're ultimately in the dustbin of history. And the reason for that, and Merriam's claim is, well, how can there be natural rights if they need to be enforced by the state? And I think that that's a cop-out answer, that, of course, in order for a right to be real, it has to be enforced, right? Like, you need to use violence to protect, these rights. They're not self-enforcing in nature. And of course, that gets into these tricky theoretical questions about nature and right and law and defining those things. But the point for the founders was that, again, there are truths that are everywhere and always. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the birthright of all men. And it is, now, of course, there are those who abuse the rights of others who need to be stopped, and they have to be stopped with violence. And that's an action human beings need to take. It's the fact that we can pursue happiness doesn't mean we're going to get it right away, or that there isn't work involved. There is, and the founders know that. And they see consent and choice as being the only valid and just way of building a regime that is not tyrannical. So they see their political project as the solution to the problem of faction, of war, of injustice. And the progressives see it as something that belongs, as I've said, to the dustbin of history. So again, Merriam talks about that the source of the state is not deliberate agreement, but rather historical development, and that rights have their source not in nature, but in positive law. So they don't come from understanding something above that transcends man, but rather are a manifestation of the will, of choice by man at various stages of development. And so, like, for Merriam, he says, quote, that the view of liberty is, quote, dependent upon the degree of civilization reached by the given people, unquote. And of course, this increases as they advance. And again, he talks about the mission of the Teutonic races is the political civilization of mankind, and the white man needs a colonial policy in order to accomplish that aim. And so, Miriam's, I think, most striking line is he says that barbaric races that show an inability to adopt civilization should be, quote, swept away, unquote. So that theoretical view that you find in Burgess and Merriam is very important. And I think you see there the interventionist side of the progressive project, and you also see the humanitarian or uplift side, that there's this moral project that's being driven by their belief in the advancement of mankind, the development of the state, what it means for man to achieve ever higher peaks. And their views were not just academic by any stretch of the imagination. They were adopted politically. And Theodore Roosevelt, when he was governor of New York, he wrote an essay called Expansion in Peace, in which he argued that the subjugation of barbarians by civilized powers was the chief means by which mankind might defeat the forces of darkness. And that's a direct quote. And so Roosevelt is defending imperial policies there. And that was something new in American life. Again, as we saw in the last episode, the founders had rejected empire. They rejected becoming, dictator of the world, of trying to, go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, intervening in European affairs. From Washington, Jefferson, Adams, John Quincy Adams, Millard Fillmore, Grover Cleveland. You see consistently over and over and over again, the founders and their heirs reject the idea of ruling over others. But for someone like Roosevelt, that old system has been swept away. And I'll just quote here from a kind of longer passage from this essay by Theodore Roosevelt entitled Expansion in Peace, because of just how clearly it states the progressive project. So for Roosevelt says, every expansion of civilization makes for peace. In other words, every expansion of a great civilized power means a victory for law, order, and righteousness. This has been the case in every instance of expansion during the present century, whether the expanding power were France or England, Russia or America. In every instance, the expansion has been of benefit, not so much to the power nominally benefited as to the whole world. In every instance, the result proved that the expanding power was doing a duty to civilization far greater and more important than they could have done by any stationary power, unquote. And so Roosevelt makes the argument for American colonization of the Philippines on this ground, that it would be dishonorable for America not to rule over these people because it was part of our duty to expand civilization. And so he says it there in that quote that the benefit is not to the nominal power in charge, but to the world. So there's this globalist project contained within progressive thought right there. And again, you saw that in Burgess and Merriam as well. The expansion of civilization is not for the sake of benefiting European man directly in terms of, we get all these additional resources. That's part of it, in part. There's this moral expansion. It's about what you do for others. You're ruling over these people for their own good. You're bringing them science and clean drinking water and teaching them to wash their hands and wipe their bottom and do all eat with a knife and fork and whatever else, because you believe in the global project of uplift, of all of mankind on the race to something glorious and to a higher stage of development. And again, that's not the founder's view. The founder's view is don't care, right? Like, you can have peaceful relations with other peoples or the barbarians, but you're not interested you're not going to rule over them, but you're also not there to uplift them at gunpoint. But that doesn't go together. The attitude of the founders to the other races, to other nations, was to leave them alone and to have peaceful relations if possible, and to really not, there's, of course, private American citizens who would go abroad and do things, but the American government was profoundly not concerned with whether or not people in the Ottoman Empire had liberty, whether or not Filipinos were reading books and had learned about Jesus. That was not a concern of the founders at all, just not. And their concerns were the defense of person and property, much more focused. The protection of Americans, the protection of non-Americans, not important. right? The extent of America's duties was negative. Don't harm other people. And as far as you do that, that's fine. That's justice. You've left them alone. They can rule over themselves, consent to their own regime. If bad things happen elsewhere, well, that's not the concern of the American social contract, of the American regime. And so the theoretical arguments there from the progressives became manifest in American policy in the Spanish-American War. And that's where you really see this transformation of American life. That for the first time, the United States embarks on an openly humanitarian crusade to liberate the Cuban people. During the war, we acquire colonies abroad in the form of Puerto Rico and then the Philippines and some insular territories in the Pacific. And this is important because the United States is probably about to go to war with Cuba again. And that reflects a long-standing American policy. This will be nothing new, right? Sometimes I'll see people say Donald Trump is transforming the world order. I wish, I think he's transforming America domestically, but the policies that, invading Cuba is a long-standing background in American life. This is not a new policy to be involved in Cuba and Cuban affairs and trying to uplift these people and bring them democracy or whatever else, making sure they're not ruled by stupid people. This goes back to the beginning of the progressive era. It's bound up in that project. The Spanish-American War is the reason the United States has a base in Cuba, like Guantanamo Bay. So again, America's relationship with Cuba is long-standing. Prior to the Spanish-American War, there had been anti-piracy operations conducted by the American Navy in the Cuban territory. But it really, what will show is that President William McKinley, had just a radical shift in terms of his approach to Cuba and to foreign policy as such. McKinley's the best articulation is the speech in which McKinley requests a declaration of war with Spain from April of 1898. The striking thing about McKinley's speech is that he discusses America as a humane power, that the need to intervene is for the, quote, cause of humanity, which means, in his words, putting an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries now existing in Cuba, unquote, and perpetuated by the Spanish. So McKinley's concern right there from the beginning in that speech is, we need to uplift the Cubans. We need to save them from being abused by this foreign European power. The concern of the war, the first concern, is not the defense of American rights and liberties. That's not what's going on there. For McKinley, American neutrality and non-intervention need to be set aside for the sake of ending the inhumane treatment of a foreign people. That is a very striking innovation in American political thought. And McKinley does try and make, in that April 1898 speech, he tries to connect the war to American interests. He claims at one point that America might be threatened. It's like there's a possibility of war, and so we have to prepare for war. So that means we should go to war now so we don't have to prepare for war. I think that's a very stupid argument. He does mention the Maine, but the battleship that blew up. But he also points out in that speech that it's not clear why that happened. So he rests a lot less of the war fever on that claim than is sometimes commonly understood. That the Remember the Maine fever, associated with the newspapers, that William Randolph Hearst, that was less important than McKinley's arguments for the humane intervention. There's a great quote from McKinley here. He says, quote, "The spirit of all our acts hitherto has been an earnest, unselfish desire for peace and prosperity in Cuba, untarnished by differences between us and Spain and unstained by the blood of American citizens," unquote. So again, for McKinley, this unselfish or selfless foreign policy in the desire for the peace and prosperity of other peoples is that fundamental justification for involvement. And I think that that is striking to me. It's the striking core of the progressive turn. And it is remarkable the effect the Spanish-American War then had on American lives. Like the consequence is the United States engages in this humanitarian crusade. Part of the war is the Navy seizes the colonies in the Philippines. Suddenly we have bases abroad. We have this territory which we now possess in a foreign country, and what do we do with it? And out of the Spanish-American War flows a further involvement in China, which would become absolutely central to American foreign policy throughout the 20th century, and I think ultimately drove American involvement in World War II due to our commitment to Chinese sovereignty. And you see that most clearly in the open door note. All right, the open door note. So the United States, through the Spanish-American War and the seizure of the Philippines, comes to have a much greater role in China. And a lot of this is connected ultimately to the Boxer Rebellion that happens in 1899. The United States, China throughout the 19th century had been imploding, and a bunch of foreigners, the British, the French, the Russians, had in various ways begun infringing upon Chinese sovereignty. And the United States, once it had access to the Philippines, now was in China's near abroad and was much more involved in policy in China, much more involved there. There were missionaries there, etc. In 1899, there was a big nationalist backlash by the Chinese against foreigners. This resulted in an intervention by other countries, including the United States, to rescue and protect their citizens from marauding Chinese gangs that were out to kill them. And the result of that intervention was that the United States pledged itself through the open door note to the preservation of Chinese sovereignty. And the goal of that policy was to prevent China from being carved up by the European powers and to allow equal trade access for others. But it's a striking level of intervention that's going on there. The American regime is now pledging itself to the preservation of another nation's sovereignty, dictating how other colonial powers should involve themselves in that territory. And that relationship with China would become very important for the United States all throughout the 20th century. Like I said, it's connected very much to the antagonism with Japan. And I'll get into that in future episodes. But what I really want to highlight is the way in which these humanitarian urges, this humanitarian desire to protect China, protect the Cubans, help the Filipinos, manifests itself as a new interventionist foreign policy. Here you see the American empire developing itself, right? It's coming into its own in a way that it had not existed before. And so to extend my critique of Scott Greer's argument would be something like the United States is very much a different country after the progressive era. Things are different. The American involvement in the Philippines was very much a break from the older American consensus. The United States fights us insurgency against Filipino nationalist rebels. There's a lot of killing that goes on there. The United States Army is outright ruling over this people that does not want to be ruled by the American government. It's interesting to see policies that Americans take for granted now were first developed overseas and then brought back to the United States. For instance, the Philippines colony is the first place that the United States federal government develops drug policy, where you see restriction on the sale of drugs. You first see that in the Philippines, and then you see it in American policy later. So, if memory serves here, the first American drug policy in the Philippines occurs in 1904, and the first American Food and Drug Acts began in 1914. So there's this interim period where you first see progressive missionaries and moralizers go abroad to develop these policies and bring them back. In the Philippines, is the first time the United States government subsidizes home mortgages. So we take this for granted now through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. and through federal farm loan banks and FAA loans and the VA loan. There's a ton of government involvement in housing. But at the time, in the early 1900s, that was not the case. And you first see the progressives develop those policies abroad in the Philippines. So drug policy, home mortgage policy, insurgency, those aspects of progressive governance, expert rule are developed abroad first. And you can see in China through the open door note, you see the desire to intervene to uplift and save a power from being carved up. And it's framed in terms of this is a policy that we need in order to help China and help the Chinese people develop themselves. So on the one hand, you have the progressives with their arguments about ruling the lesser races, but then you also see there's an uplift policy connected to this. We need to help the poor the poor barbarians who are being cruelly abused by selfish European powers. So it's not simple. It's not enough just to say, well, the progressives supported eugenics or racism and white supremacy. It's no. Their racism is very much connected to duties for white people and standards for white people and standards for how the Europeans especially should involve themselves in the world. The American progressives see themselves as superior to their fellow white people. They have a project that is it's not simply white nationalism or something like that. The idea of civilization and its expansion can be applied to whites who are not doing what they should, quote unquote, in the progressive conception of the expansion of civilization. Connected to this is this speech by Albert Beveridge. I should include that here. He says of the peoples of the United States. He says he has this speech, the March of the Flag. Some of you may have seen this like in AP US history or something like that. He says that regarding the peoples of the earth, the United States, he just talks about America as this divine mission, the March of the Flag, to extend our borders and secure resources for ourselves. And he says of the peoples that we're going to conquer, shall we turn these peoples back to the reeking hands from which we have taken them? Shall we abandon them with Germany, England, Japan hungering for them? Shall we save them from those nations to give them a self-rule of tragedy? Unquote. And he's talking about the Philippines here. He says, quote, if we do our duty aright in the Philippines, we will add to that national renown, which is the highest and finest part of national wealth, unquote. So again, it's striking there that for Beveridge, he's saying this in 1898, that American conquest is a critique of the Europeans. It's a critique. At the same moment that they're arguing for the extension of civilization and the greatness of the Teutonic nations, there's also a criticism that these other, the white man's burden isn't being borne equally, that some white people are failing to do their duty. And they need to be taught and educated, but that there's teachable moments that are happening all over the place here. The United States isn't just uplifting the barbarian races. It's also educating the other European powers in what progressive scientific management and colonial projects look like. And that dimension of the progressive project has to be emphasized. It's just too easy to fall into the post-1965 view of everything's white supremacy. And so there's an inability to think clearly about just what were the progressives thinking? How did they frame their own project? And it does, of course, have this a sense of racial supremacy, but it's connected to uplift always. And I think that explains then how you get anti-racism out of this, view of Western supremacy, so to speak. And I think there's a very important, lesson here to be learned for those now on the right, especially who want to see in the progressives a kind of model for their own for their own foreign policy vision. And I think that's dangerous. I think, concerning yourself with the third world, with ruling others, uplifting them, managing them, even ruling, dominating them, you're always still messing with them, right? Intervention in the name of morality and intervention in the name of dominion are both still intervention. They're both still, you're concerning yourself with this problem in a way that you weren't doing so before. You have changed your regime in a fundamental way when you reorient it away from protection and towards uplift and missionary crusading, or to dominion for that matter. And I know this is an area where I think, have kind of out of step with the sort of sweeping view on the right. It's based. We should have colonies that would be based. I don't think that. I don't want to have colonies. I don't want to rule over these people because I see where it goes. This progressive project was based, right? Like they conquered the Philippines. Oh, awesome. Bronze Age mindset, bro. Except what that meant in practice, of course, is the expansion of the administrative state. And, you see all of these regulations and involvement in humanitarian projects linked in. This leftist project of uplift flows out of this colonial view that comes, that's present in progressive thought. Yeah, that's a real problem. And again, for whatever it's worth, and this may only make sense to some of you in the audience, but I don't think that's actually what Bapp is talking about in his book. I don't think he's simply endorsing the progressive project, though I think at times he seems to have done so in other places. But I do think it's easy for young men now on the right to look at the progressives, at their spirit of adventure, their sense of self-confidence, their longing to go abroad, and see in them the model for their own politics. The progressives are they're aware, man. They're based. They get the relevant details and facts, and they have this spirit of dominion. But I think what I want to show is that they're very much breaking from the older American tradition. Those two things do not go together. And you have to say, if you're going to reject the older American tradition, that then shapes everything else in your politics, right? It's going to shape how you view you're now within that world. And I don't think that's a world I want to be in. The founders were not interested in uplift at all, right? But they were also not interested in dominion. And those two things go together. There's something very dangerous about the longing to improve the world. And a lot of foreign adventurism just ends up becoming, you're wasting blood and treasure not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of others. And it's corrosive. I think it corrodes the ability to think clearly about your own interests and about what you should be doing in the world. It's very easy to then slip back into... I think there's very much a connection, say, with neoconservatism, as it's manifested in American politics, and the Progressive Project. They're very much related. The idea of America with global interests and moral interests bound up in that. You can't really avoid that conclusion. The progressives really show what that meant and how that came to be at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, I think this is a good stopping point. I think in the next show, what I'll do is talk about World War I and the interwar period, how the lead up, how progressive era policy and the concern with the world and uplift manifested itself in international institutions, some of which we still have today. Ideas of weapons control, arms control, global pacifism, and global intervention. And I want to show how all of those things come out of the progressive era as well. But I think here, what I just want to reiterate for this show is the founders had a view of protection and consent as the pillars and lodestars of the American regime. The progressives reject that in the name of progress, uplift, humanity, racial supremacy, but combined with the idea of spreading civilization and perfecting the barbarian races. And in practice, this is a combination of supremacy and humanitarianism that go together and result in an interventionist and policy both at home and abroad. All of these things go together. And it's a real problem, I think, for the American people. It's a problem for thinking clearly about the American founding itself. And I hope what I can do is show the importance of just knowing facts about what happened in American life and that how that impacts our own views today. That's the goal. I want to draw it all out. I want to show you the story behind the story, to go to the heart of things and think clearly. That's always the goal. It's always my goal. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you've gained something here tonight. I'm always interested to hear feedback and other points of view. Please feel free to leave a comment, share, subscribe, like. I appreciate all of it. It's very valuable. I want to encourage all of you to keep using your minds, and I want to encourage you to keep the faith as well. Yeah, that's good. Keep the faith. All right. This has been another episode of Lippincott Talk. My name is Josiah Lippincott. I am your host. I am grateful you are here joining me today. I can't wait to have you here next time. Thank you.